writing and so forth, I was well aware. As I mentioned, I think last 3 years ago, Bill and I climbed the mountain together when they were visiting here back in, I believe it was in the 70s, I forget. It doesn't matter anyway. It just as Terry mentioned, being distant from each other, we weren't able to keep in contact like many families do. And I thought about the vacancy in her life that may have been responsible for some of her seeking happiness, and that is when my mother died in 1928. Helen was just 2 months short of her 6th birthday, and she loved her mother very much. Gertie, these people can't imagine if she called her. I didn't call her Gertie, but that's what everybody called her, and everybody loved her. She just was a tremendous person, and certainly my sister loved her very much. I only, in 2 occasions in my life, I was only aware of her. I didn't know that she was my mother at the time, but I do remember her on 2 occasions where, on the other hand, I remember, well, one thing I remember seeing sailboats on the water one time, and then in Harrisburg, in the Susquehanna River, which is about a mile wide at that point, they have this Kiwanis Day celebration, which are sailboats on the river there, and I remember somebody holding me and seeing the sailboats, and then later on I learned that it was my mother that had me to this Kiwanis Day. I wasn't quite 2 at the time. The other time that I remember her was, I remember somebody carrying me down a hall, and I learned later that she took me along to Chambersburg to see her sister in the hospital. And I remember her carrying, I didn't know it was her, but a lady or somebody carrying me down the hall. But that is my remembrance of my mother, whereas my sister would have been very familiar with her and certainly missed her tremendously. And because that she died, then right then we were moved to a farm in Fulton County, which is southern Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, and we lived with her grandparents. There was their name was Black, and we lived. And you saw their picture there, and it looked like somebody said it looked like the Okies, and what's the name of the
Grapes of Wrath.
Oh, Grapes of Wrath. That's what it looked like. But I'll tell you, farming was tough in those days. And anyway, my sister really wasn't happy there because there were no children around anywhere. 2 of my mothers, whether it be my uncles, 2 of them still lived at home, and one of them was in a way, very unkind. And I remember that he paddled Helen twice or so with a black belt, and my mother never forgot that she was paddled with a belt there on the farm, and that kind of stuck with her. And later on, we were in the kitchen one night in the fall of 1931. I would have just been, I guess, 5 at that time, or something like 6 maybe, I forget. Anyway, we were in the kitchen. My grandmother reached up to the top of the stove to get the coffee pot, and Helen was sitting across the table from me. And when my grandmother turned around, she collapsed and died right there in front of both of us. And of course, that was really a thing that left a picture in my mind and hers at the same time. We never forgot this. And of course, there were incidents like that I seem to have gotten over, and I don't think my mother ever did get a lot of them. And then my grandmother died. Then in the following fall, or the spring, on the last day of school, I was going to a 1-room schoolhouse there called Oak Grove No. 1, and there were about 13 people in this school. And a man came by, scraping the room with a team, and he looked down, and we were having a picnic right beside the schoolhouse, and he stopped and he said, "Did you hear Dan Black died this morning?" And Dan Black was my grandfather. And you know, that's a great thing to tell some kid the last day of school. But anyway, there it was. But then we moved to my father's mother died in 1907, and he, of course, my grandfather remarried a lady named Nora Gladfelder, and they lived in Mount Union, and this was in 1932 at the time. Well, any of you back there that lived in 1932 knows that they were pretty much dismal days, and we went there, and they had 4 daughters, and there was my step-grandmother with 4 daughters, and my grandfather Ackerman, her husband, had died in 1929 with pneumonia, and even though he was a very successful man, he was a jeweler, and he fixed watches and that, and they did very well. But when you died in 1929, if you didn't have savings bonds or something like that, you were in trouble because there was no Social Security. Anyway, that was very difficult for both my sister and I when we lived there for 2 years. My father had remarried. We moved to Harrisburg to live with them in 1934. My sister didn't get along with her stepmother. That was her personality, and my personality was just a happy kid that didn't know any better, and I got along with people. And she kind of hung to herself a little bit more, even though she was very personable as she got older. But anyway, we lived there for 2 years, and we were back in Harrisburg then in 1934. And then one thing happened while we were in Harrisburg. Her best friend, well, first of all, she didn't get along with her stepmother, but then in high school, her best friend died, and that was kind of a blow to her, too, one thing after another. Then she married Bill when she was 21, and then things were pretty well. Bill did well. Of course, they started out slowly in those days, but he did well as time went by. And then another blow came. They were living in California, and this was mentioned already, and maybe you saw the picture. Freddie, we called him, he was killed in an automobile accident out there in 1969. And was that right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Somebody told me for sure. I thought it was around 71 or something like that. But anyway, that was another blow to her, and she never really got over that. So as I stand up here and talk about Helen, without being negative, we in the family were pretty aware that she always was seeking happiness. It was just a difficult thing to accept, and she was happy in the sense that she seemed to get along with everybody pretty well, but she had this habit of just not being comfortable the way things were and so forth. But anyway, many of these obstacles in her life certainly contributed to this. And that's why I mentioned at the beginning how ironic it would be that after all of this, that she, and as I said, in the twilight of her life, while she would feel this tremendous gift of happiness that came to her. And forgive me for being negative, but some of you didn't know this history of her. It was pretty tough for us because we grew up during a depression, and some of you who grew up during a depression realized things were pretty tough. But anyway, I just wanted to say that as far as this happiness coming to her, that I'm sure really that the Lord was involved in that. I read a poem here recently, and I just want to say it real quick. It's called Life's Weaving, because it applied not only to my sister, but to many of us. We've all had obstacles in our lives, and we lived through them and went right on beyond that period of time, and we maybe remembered it, but we didn't dwell on it too much. And anyway, this was written by a Father Tab. I assume that he was a Catholic priest. If he'd be called Father, that's obviously he wouldn't be a Presbyterian minister, I don't think. But it reads, "My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I may not choose the colors, he knows what they should be. For he can view the pattern upon the upper side, while I can see it only on this, the other side. Sometimes he weaveth sorrow, which seemeth strange to me, but I will trust his judgment and work so faithfully. 'Tis he who fills the shuttle, he knows just what is best. So I will weave in earnest and leave with him the rest. At last, when life is ended, with him I shall abide, that I may view the pattern upon the upper side. Then I shall know the reason why pain, say that again, why pain with joy entwine, was woven in the fabric of life that God designed.